On August 15, 717, the ancient walls of Constantinople trembled under the shadow of doom. Emperor Leo III stood on the Theodosian ramparts, watching an impossible horde approaching across the horizon. From his vantage point, the 32-year-old Isaurian strategist could see the Umayyad Arab army stretching endlessly before him. 200,000 warriors sprawled across the Thracian plains like an endless sea of steel and banners, their campfires stretching to the edge of sight. Against this overwhelming force, Leo commanded exactly 15,000 Byzantine troops, huddled behind the triple walls. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. 13-to-1 odds. 13 enemies for every single defender. Picture this moment. You're standing atop Constantinople's massive triple walls, the greatest fortifications ever built by human hands. The salty breeze from the Bosphorus carries the distant clamor of enemy camps, the ring of hammers on anvils, the neighing of thousands of horses, the chants of soldiers preparing for holy war. Your scouts have just returned with news that chills your blood to ice. Not 80,000 enemies as you feared. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the chaos that preceded this moment. The Byzantine Empire had been torn apart by what historians call the 20 Years' Anarchy, a period of brutal political instability that saw 7 different emperors rise and fall through coups and assassinations. Leo III wasn't supposed to be emperor. He'd seized the throne just months earlier, and political rivals still plotted his downfall from within the city walls. At 32 years old, this former military commander from the rugged mountains of Isauria faced enemies on all sides. Yet standing against him across those plains was Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, arguably the most brilliant Arab general of his generation, a man who'd commanded victorious armies from the deserts of Persia to the cities of Spain, who'd personally overseen the sacking of fortified cities that had stood for centuries. The Byzantine Empire was far more desperate than most people realize when they read about this siege in history books. For nearly a century, the Arab-Byzantine Wars had stripped away the empire's richest provinces one by one. Egypt, the breadbasket that had fed Rome itself, was gone. Syria, with its ancient cities and trading wealth, had fallen. North Africa, once home to Carthage and Augustine, now flew the banner of the Caliphate. Constantinople itself, the queen of cities, the eye of the world, stood as the last major Christian stronghold between the advancing tide of Islam and the heart of Europe. If it fell, there would be nothing to stop Arab armies from sweeping through the Balkans, into Italy, across to the very gates of Rome itself. But the Umayyad Caliphate wasn't some ragtag collection of desert raiders. They'd rebuilt their grand army in Damascus with meticulous care and overwhelming resources. They commanded 200,000 men, including the elite Syrian heavy infantry, veterans of jihad, armed with the finest weapons the medieval world could produce, and driven by fanatical religious zeal that made them fearless in battle. Their fleet of 1,800 ships represented the largest naval force assembled in the Mediterranean since the days of ancient Rome. With these vessels, they could blockade the city completely, cutting off food supplies and starving the population into submission. Back in Constantinople, political enemies waited like vultures circling a dying animal. One major defeat, one breach in the walls, and Leo's enemies would move. The empire would collapse from within before the Arabs even broke through. Rival generals, ambitious nobles, and disgruntled aristocrats all watched and waited for Leo to fail. This wasn't just another siege in a long war. It was Leo's final gamble for survival, both his own and Christian Europe's. The morning of August 15, 717, had started as routine as any patrol during wartime. Leo needed to assess supplies for his 15,000 troops camped behind the walls to calculate how long they could hold out against a siege. The local terrain favored his enemies completely. Unlike open battlefields where Byzantine cavalry might have maneuvered, Constantinople's peninsula offered limited space for defense, while simultaneously providing sea access that allowed enemy resupply. The Arab force that emerged from the morning mist was beyond human comprehension. 200,000 warriors moved like a tidal wave of humanity, their advance units alone outnumbering Leo's entire garrison. General Maslama had orchestrated a force breakdown that showcased the Caliphate's terrifying military might. 80,000 elite Syrian infantry, the best trained and equipped soldiers in the Islamic world, veterans of campaigns across 3 continents. These weren't conscripts or militia. They were professional warriors who'd spent their entire adult lives conquering empires. 100,000 Arab cavalry and archers, mounted troops who could move with lightning speed, shoot with deadly accuracy from horseback, and harass defenders without ever coming within reach of Byzantine swords. 20,000 support units, engineers, siege weapon specialists, supply troops, and naval personnel manning 1,800 ships. This armada was capable of completely blockading the city and starving its population into submission within months. The logistics alone were staggering. Feeding and supplying 200,000 men required organizational genius. Yet Maslama had planned for everything. Supply lines stretching back through Anatolia, forward bases stockpiled with months of provisions, and the naval blockade ensuring continuous resupply from Arab-controlled territories. Here's what sources like the Byzantine chronicler Theophanes don't tell you about Leo's situation that morning, something that only becomes clear when you study multiple accounts and read between the lines of what survived. Leo's intelligence reports had shown scattered Arab advances over the previous weeks. Probing attacks here, cavalry raids there, naval demonstrations in the Sea of Marmara. Standard pre-siege reconnaissance, or so it seemed. The reality was far more sinister. A full strategic encirclement that had been months in preparation. The Arabs understood Byzantine exhaustion better than the Byzantines themselves. The empire had been bleeding for decades. Treasury depleted. Army reduced to skeleton garrisons. Political leadership fractured by constant coups. A careful, patient enemy could exploit these weaknesses by offering what appeared to be simply a prolonged siege, letting time and starvation do the work that assault might fail to accomplish. The enemy had studied Byzantine defensive tactics with scholarly precision. They knew Leo would rely on the legendary Theodosian Walls, triple-layered fortifications that had turned back every attacker for 3 centuries. They knew he'd conserve his small garrison behind those walls rather than risk them in the open field. They knew his navy was outnumbered 10-1. As the Arab banners first appeared on the horizon that August morning, Leo's senior advisors urged him to order immediate sorties, hit-and-run raids to disrupt the enemy's siege preparations before they could dig in properly. Standard Byzantine doctrine, practiced for centuries, demanded aggressive cavalry raids against besieging forces. But Leo had spent his entire military career proving that standard doctrine was for ordinary commanders facing ordinary circumstances. This was neither. He stood silent on the walls, studying the enemy deployment with the intense focus that had earned him his reputation as a military innovator. His officers grew increasingly nervous as he said nothing, simply watching as 200,000 enemies surrounded his city like a noose tightening around a neck. Inside the imperial palace, the war council had devolved into barely controlled panic. The great hall, once the scene of triumph and celebration, now echoed with desperate voices. Leo paced restlessly before the assembled generals and nobles, his face etched with determination that masked inner turmoil. The relentless bombardment from Arab siege engines sent tremors through the ancient stone floors. Every general in that chamber knew exactly what the scouts had reported. 200,000 Arabs were digging in for winter, building permanent fortifications, settling in for a siege that could last years if necessary. Patriarch Germanus, the spiritual leader of Byzantine Christianity, spoke what everyone was thinking but had been afraid to voice. "Your Majesty, we must sue for peace or face annihilation. God himself cannot expect 15,000 men to defeat 200,000. Others nodded agreement, their faces grim. General Artabasdos, one of Leo's most trusted commanders, suggested evacuation by sea, load the imperial treasury, the holy relics, and the emperor himself onto fast ships and flee to Sicily or Italy, where resistance could continue from safety. Even the normally brave Varangian guards, Norse warriors famous for their fearlessness, remained silent, their usual boasts and bravado absent. The situation was that desperate. Mathematics didn't lie. 13 enemies for every defender meant certain death if the walls were breached. Then Leo did something that stunned even his closest advisors. He stopped pacing, turned to face them, and despite the overwhelming odds, despite the mathematical impossibility of victory, he demanded immediate deployment of the secret weapon, the one advantage Byzantium possessed that Arabs had never faced in such concentration. His voice, when it came, was clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the hall. "We shall unleash the fire of heaven upon them. We shall turn their fleet to ashes, and their siege to a funeral pyre." The room erupted in shocked protests. Madness. Had the stress broken his sanity? The secret of Greek fire was jealously guarded, but everyone knew its limitations. It worked in close naval combat, but against 1,800 ships, against the largest fleet ever assembled. What happened next defied every principle of military logic that had been developed over centuries of warfare. Instead of negotiating surrender terms, instead of preparing for a desperate final stand behind the walls, Leo ordered immediate naval counterattacks. The dromons, Byzantine war galleys equipped with Greek fire siphons, would launch within the hour, taking every sailor who could man a pump or wield a weapon. The insanity of the plan was breathtaking in its audacity. Sail through enemy-controlled waters to attack a navy that outnumbered them 10-1. Launch Greek fire, a weapon that required close range to be effective, against Arab ships that would see them coming from miles away. Here's what military historians still can't fully explain when they analyze this battle. The sorties that followed should have resulted in the destruction of half the Byzantine fleet before they even engaged the enemy. They had to cross miles of open water in the Bosphorus in choppy autumn conditions. Men in heavy armor, already exhausted from weeks of constant vigilance, rowing war galleys against the current. Storms turned the sea into a churning hell of green water and white foam. Crews fell overboard, their armor dragging them to the bottom. Ships nearly capsized in the swells. Yet they kept going, driven by Leo's orders and the desperate knowledge that this was their only chance. The Byzantine dromons were technological marvels, sleek galleys equipped with bronze siphons mounted at the bow, connected to pressurized tanks filled with the mysterious Greek fire. The exact composition remained one of history's most closely guarded secrets, known only to a handful of specialists who mixed the ingredients in sealed workshops. Meanwhile, across the waters in the Arab camp, General Maslama had made the fatal decision that would ultimately cost him everything he'd worked to achieve. Completely confident in his overwhelming numerical superiority, completely certain that the siege would be won through patient starvation rather than dramatic assault, he'd allowed his army to camp loosely around the city. The scene in the Arab encampment was one of relaxed confidence bordering on arrogance. Tents sprawled without proper defensive perimeters. Cavalry horses grazed in open fields. Supply wagons sat unguarded. His officers were already dividing the spoils of a city they hadn't yet conquered, arguing over which palaces they'd claim, which churches they'd convert to mosques. Maslama himself had brought treasures from Damascus for the victory parades he was already planning in his mind. He wasn't preparing for a battle. He was preparing for a coronation in the Hagia Sophia, imagining himself as the conqueror who would finally break the greatest Christian city. By winter of 717, as Leo's impossible preparations continued behind the walls, scouts brought electrifying news to the Byzantine war room. The Arabs weren't prepared for a winter siege. Despite their massive numbers, disease was beginning to spread through the crowded encampments. The siege that was supposed to starve Constantinople was instead creating vulnerabilities in the besiegers themselves. God, it seemed to the devout Byzantines, had delivered the enemy exactly as Leo had prophesied, overconfident, unprepared, and vulnerable. September 1st, 717, dawned stormy and ominous, the sky dark with clouds that promised rain. Arab naval scouts had made a critical mistake that would cost approximately 30,000 lives before the day was done. They'd positioned their blockading fleet close to the shore, seeking shelter from the weather, assuming the Byzantines would never venture out in such conditions. The winds brought the first advantage to Leo's desperate gambit. Byzantine scouts returned from reconnaissance with news that made even the most exhausted sailors stand straighter and grip their oars tighter. The enemy fleet had drifted closer to the walls during the night, seeking calmer waters, and now sat within perfect striking range. At dawn, Maslama received his first warning that something was terribly wrong. Flames appeared on the horizon, not the cook fires of camp, but something different, something moving. His initial reaction was complete disbelief, verging on contempt. His scouts had confirmed a secure blockade just hours earlier. Byzantine ships penned in the Golden Horn. It had to be a trick, some kind of diversion. He sent orders for minor patrol adjustments, nothing more. This casual dismissal, this fundamental underestimation of Leo's audacity, would haunt Maslama for the rest of his life. By midday, as the storm intensified, the terrible truth became undeniable. Byzantine dromons appeared in the Strait of Bosphorus, not scouting vessels sneaking through shadows, but fire-armed warships advancing in battle formation, their bronze siphons gleaming in the intermittent sunlight. The Arabs' scattered naval forces began frantically trying to reform their defensive lines, captains screaming orders, crews scrambling to battle stations. But seconds are an eternity when your enemy is already within striking distance, already raising the terrible weapons that would unleash liquid fire across the waves. Here's where legend meets reality in one of history's most dramatic reversals. Every principle of military logic, every manual of siege warfare, every precedent from centuries of battles said the same thing with absolute certainty. The defender stays behind the walls. You reinforce fortifications. You wait out the besiegers. You never, ever expose your navy to a superior fleet in open combat. Never attack when outnumbered 10-1. Never rely on secret weapons that might fail. Never risk everything on a single desperate gamble. Leo was about to violate every one of these sacred rules of warfare. Leo's revolutionary decision represented a complete paradigm shift in siege defense. Instead of passive resistance, instead of waiting for the enemy to wear themselves out against impregnable walls, he ordered something never before attempted against Arab naval forces in open waters with such limited numbers. His 15,000 defenders would take the offensive. They would unleash Greek fire through bronze siphons mounted on fast-moving dromons, turning the sea itself into a weapon. To every officer who heard the command, it sounded like elaborate suicide. Why it seemed insane was obvious to everyone. Greek fire required close range. You had to be within yards of enemy ships to use it effectively. Getting that close to 1-800 enemy vessels meant running a gauntlet of arrows, javelins, and catapult fire. The flames themselves were unpredictable, dangerous to the users if wind shifted. One mistake, and Byzantine ships would burn as readily as Arab ones. But Leo had seen something that Maslama's vast experience had caused him to overlook. He'd studied the local waters for months, consulted with every fisherman and sailor who knew these currents. The Bosphorus Strait, where it narrowed near the Golden Horn, created natural funnels in the water flow. What looked like open sea was actually channeling enemy ships closer together, concentrating them. The emperor had recognized what the general had missed. Geography could overcome numbers if exploited with perfect timing and absolute commitment. At exactly noon, with storm clouds breaking just enough to provide visibility, Leo raised his signal banner from the Bucolion Palace overlooking the harbor. 100 dromons, virtually every operational war galley Byzantium still possessed, began their assault run against 1,800 Arab vessels. The first flames struck like divine thunderbolts, hurled from heaven itself. Greek fire, that mysterious mixture of petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, and secret ingredients known only to Byzantine chemists, shot from bronze siphons in streams of liquid hell. The assault smashed into the Arab fleet at full ramming speed. The sound was like nothing witnesses had ever heard. The roar of flames consuming wood and canvas, the screams of burning men throwing themselves into the sea, the crack of hulls splitting as dromons rammed through the chaos they'd created. In those first horrific seconds, 20 Arab ships simply ceased to exist, engulfed in unquenchable fire that water couldn't extinguish. The flames clung to everything they touched, wood, rope, sail, flesh, burning with an intensity that turned ships into floating funeral pyres within minutes. But the real shock wasn't the initial impact. It was what followed. Instead of retreating after the first strike, instead of racing back to the safety of the Golden Horn, the Byzantines did the unthinkable. They pursued the burning vessels deeper into the enemy fleet, sowing chaos and terror wherever they went. The sustained assault was methodical and merciless. Bronze siphons spewing liquid fire in continuous streams, turning the blue waters of the Bosphorus into a hellscape of orange flames and black smoke. The dromons moved through the enemy fleet like avenging angels of destruction, their crews working with disciplined precision, despite the horror surrounding them. The charge covered miles of water in under an hour, 15,000 defenders, sailors, marines and warriors, moving with unified purpose. Their battle cry of Deus vult, God wills it, drowned out Arab commanders' desperate orders to reform, to counterattack, to do anything to stop the onslaught. By dusk on that first day, as the sun set blood-red through the smoke covering the Bosphorus, something unprecedented began to happen in the Arab army. The center formation, 100,000 warriors who'd stood confident that morning, began to waver. Not an orderly retreat, not a tactical repositioning. They began to disintegrate like a house of cards in a windstorm. The Arab officers, hardened veterans of countless battles, couldn't believe what their eyes were showing them. How could 15,000 exhausted Byzantines be pushing back 13 times their number? How could Greek fire, devastating as it was, be causing such complete psychological collapse? The physics didn't work. The mathematics were impossible. Yet it was happening before their eyes. Then something occurred that defied all military logic and experience. Panic, that most contagious of battlefield emotions, spread like wildfire through the vast Arab encampment. The sight of the fleet burning, the news of thousands dead in a single afternoon, the realization that their impregnable blockade had been shattered in hours, it all combined into overwhelming terror. Within minutes, the initial wavering became a full rout. Commands became screams. Formation dissolved into chaos as men fled from an enemy they couldn't fight, from fire they couldn't extinguish, from a defeat they couldn't understand. The impossible was happening. 200,000 warriors were being psychologically routed by a force they outnumbered 13-1. As autumn turned to winter and the siege dragged on for months, Leo received unexpected reinforcements that would seal the Arabs' fate. The Bulgarian Khan Tervel, long an enemy of Byzantium, saw opportunity in Arab weakness. His forces struck the Arab rear camps in coordinated attacks with Byzantine sorties. Spring 718 brought the unthinkable final collapse. Arab elite Syrian units, the backbone of the entire army, veterans of 100 conquests across 3 continents, these legendary soldiers broke. These were men who'd faced Persian war elephants without flinching, who'd stormed fortress walls under hails of arrows, who'd never known defeat. Yet faced with Greek fire, starvation, disease, and Bulgarian cavalry, they ran. The sight of the elite units abandoning their posts shattered what remained of Arab morale throughout the entire army. If the Syrian veterans, the best soldiers in the Islamic world, were fleeing, what hope did common soldiers and conscripts have? Maslama himself, the brilliant general who'd conquered cities and defeated empires, made a decision that would haunt him until his dying day. He ordered full retreat, not tactical withdrawal, not strategic repositioning, full, immediate retreat from Constantinople. The sight of their commanding general fleeing, his banner abandoned in the mud, destroyed the last vestige of Arab resistance. The pursuit became a massacre that lasted through the summer of 718. Byzantine and Bulgarian forces, their blood up from months of desperate defense, chased fleeing Arabs for hundreds of miles across Thrace and Anatolia. The killing was mechanical, efficient, and horrible. Bodies choked rivers, turning the water red. Fields became graveyards. When the siege finally lifted at dawn on August 15th, 718, exactly 1 year after it had begun, the killing ground revealed scenes that would haunt chroniclers for centuries. The fields around Constantinople were carpeted with an estimated 150,000 Arab dead. Bodies piled in twisted heaps where men had fallen, armor stripped by looters, weapons scattered like leaves after a storm. Against this staggering carnage, Byzantine casualties seemed almost miraculous. Approximately 3,000 dead from the original garrison of 15,000 defenders. The exchange rate, the number of enemy killed for each defender lost, was roughly 50 to 1. Numbers that seemed impossible, that strained credibility, yet were confirmed by multiple independent sources. The immediate material gains defied calculation. The Arab army had carried enough wealth to sustain 200,000 men for years of campaigning. Gold and silver for paying soldiers, weapons and armor for equipping armies, horses by the thousands, supplies that could feed cities. In a matter of days, it all became Byzantine property. More importantly for the empire's future, they captured intact Arab siege engines, catapults, trebuchets, siege towers, and the engineers who knew how to build and operate them. Technology that Byzantium had lost in previous defeats now returned to strengthen future defenses. But here's what the chronicler Theophanes and other sources reveal about the true cost of victory. Disease ravaged the survivors on both sides. The concentration of so many bodies created pestilence that spread through the region. The Byzantine Empire, though saved from conquest, was still fundamentally weakened by the ordeal. Provinces had been devastated. The treasury was empty. The army needed years to rebuild. It was a Pyrrhic victory in many ways. They'd won, but at a cost that left them vulnerable to future threats. The news of the catastrophic defeat at Constantinople reached Damascus weeks later, carried by exhausted messengers who had ridden non-stop with tidings that would shake the Islamic world. Caliph Umar II received the reports in stunned silence, unable to comprehend how the largest army ever assembled by the Caliphate had been destroyed by a force 1/13 its size. The psychological shockwave rippled through every level of Arab society. From powerful emirs commanding provinces to peasants working the fields, a sense of despair spread like plague. If Constantinople, which had seemed on the verge of falling, could inflict such devastating defeat, what hope existed for future conquests into Europe? Arab raids into Byzantine territory, which had been annual occurrences for decades, halted for years. The aggressive expansion that had characterized the Umayyad Caliphate's first-century ground to a halt as leaders reassessed strategies and rebuilt shattered armies. Caliph Umar II himself, though a capable and pious ruler, died within 2 years. Some sources suggesting the psychological blow of the defeat contributed to his decline. For the Byzantines, the immediate aftermath brought celebrations unlike anything the empire had seen in generations. Feasts lasted for months in Constantinople, the grateful populace rejoicing in their deliverance from what had seemed certain doom. Church bells rang for weeks without ceasing. The Hagia Sophia overflowed with worshippers thanking God for their miraculous salvation. Most importantly, the strategic situation transformed overnight. Borders that had crumbled under decades of Arab pressure suddenly found courage to resist. Fortress commanders who'd been contemplating surrender instead strengthened their defenses. Byzantine morale, which had been near collapse, soared to heights not seen since the glory days of Justinian. The strategic consequences of the Siege of Constantinople unfolded with remarkable speed across the next decade. Frontiers that had been retreating for a century suddenly stabilized and even began advancing. Towns that had prepared to submit to Arab rule instead rallied to Byzantine banners. Antioch, the ancient gateway city between Anatolia and Syria, fell to Byzantine raids in 720, a reversal that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. The very fortresses that had anchored Arab power in Asia Minor for decades crumbled like dominoes before the renewed Byzantine military, which had learned valuable lessons about combining traditional tactics with the devastating effectiveness of Greek fire. Here's what military historians discovered when they studied the battle's tactical innovations centuries later. The Siege of Constantinople became the template for successful defensive warfare against numerically superior forces. Its principles would echo through history. Charles Martel studied accounts of Leo's victory, when preparing to face Arab invasion at the Battle of Tours in 732. Venetian naval tactics at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 employed Greek fire-inspired weapons. Even modern naval fire suppression systems owe conceptual debt to the principles that Leo III perfected on that August day in 717. The battle proved that technological innovation, when combined with brilliant tactical application, could overcome overwhelming numerical superiority. It demonstrated that defenders' advantages, knowledge of local terrain, interior supply lines, fortified positions, could be leveraged to achieve seemingly impossible victories. The cultural memory of the siege embedded itself in Byzantine consciousness with surprising permanence. Religious icons depicting the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos, protecting Constantinople, emerged directly from the victory, with dates commemorating August 15, 718. Even modern Orthodox Christian traditions in Greece and Eastern Europe celebrate aspects of the siege in their liturgical calendars and religious art. Leo III himself reigned for another 2 decades after his impossible victory. The emperor who had achieved what no one believed possible went on to reform the Byzantine Empire systematically. He reorganized the military into the theme system, regional commands that would prove their worth for centuries. He reformed taxation, rebuilt the treasury, and strengthened the administrative apparatus that had nearly collapsed during the 20 Years' Anarchy. However, his reign wasn't without controversy. Leo launched the iconoclasm movement, the destruction of religious images, which tore Byzantine society apart and created a schism with the Western Church that would have long-lasting consequences. Yet even his religious opponents couldn't deny his military genius and the debt the empire owed him for its survival. When Leo III died in 741 at the age of 56, even his enemies mourned the loss of a worthy foe and brilliant strategist. His dynasty, the Isaurian dynasty, would rule Byzantium for generations, building on the foundation he'd established during those desperate months of 717-718. The opposing commander, Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, survived the catastrophe but never recovered his reputation. Of the 200,000 men who had besieged Constantinople's walls with such confidence, barely 30,000 limped back to Damascus months after the retreat began. The rest lay dead in Thracian fields or had deserted during the chaotic withdrawal. Maslama's reputation as an invincible general lay shattered. Though he'd once been considered a potential caliph, his defeat ensured he'd never achieve such heights. Arab chronicles, normally generous to their commanders, couldn't disguise the magnitude of the disaster. Some called him the lion who fled from fire, a mocking epithet that followed him to his grave. He lived another 2 decades, commanding minor operations, but never again led major campaigns. The shadow of Constantinople darkened every remaining year of his life. Modern military academies still study the Siege of Constantinople as the ultimate defensive masterpiece, and one of history's most dramatic examples of asymmetric warfare. Staff colleges from West Point to Sandhurst, from St. Cyr to Russia's Frunze Academy, teach the battle's core principles to officer candidates. Innovation under pressure. Leo's willingness to employ Greek fire offensively rather than defensively revolutionized naval warfare. His recognition that secret weapons must be used boldly, not hoarded cautiously, represented breakthrough thinking. Alliance building. Leo's diplomatic outreach to the Bulgarians, traditional enemies, demonstrated pragmatic statecraft. The willingness to set aside old grudges to face existential threats proved decisive. Logistical denial. Understanding that the Arab army's greatest vulnerability was its supply system, Leo's strategy focused on disrupting enemy logistics rather than matching them in direct combat power. Leo's year-long defensive masterpiece became a template for how smaller forces could defeat larger ones through superior tactics, technology, and terrain exploitation. The lessons learned at Constantinople would influence military thinking for over a millennium. But perhaps the battle's greatest legacy lay not in tactical manuals and strategy textbooks, but in what it revealed about human resilience and the unpredictability of warfare. The Siege of Constantinople proved that technology, will, and innovation can overcome raw numerical superiority. It demonstrated that nothing in war is truly inevitable, that brilliant leadership and desperate courage can rewrite supposedly predetermined outcomes. The philosophical implications resonated through medieval and modern military thought. Walls and fire can turn invaders to ash. Faith and determination can overcome mathematical impossibility. The human spirit, when defending home and civilization, becomes a weapon as potent as any blade or flame. Yet there's a cruel irony in the battle's aftermath. The siege's very success sowed seeds of future problems. Leo's military reforms and religious policies, particularly iconoclasm, sparked internal strife that would weaken the empire for generations. The victory over Arabs, magnificent as it was, couldn't prevent later Ottoman challenges that would eventually bring down Constantinople in 1453, 7 centuries later, August 15th, 717. The dawn that had hidden 15,000 desperate Byzantine defenders behind triple walls gave way to dusk 1 year later that revealed 150,000 Arab dead scattered across the killing fields of Thrace. The mathematics that had seemed so simple, 13 enemies for every defender, had been rewritten in blood and fire. Yet Emperor Leo III, the leader who achieved the impossible, discovered a truth that echoes through history. Some victories demand eternal vigilance. Saving an empire doesn't end with a single battle, no matter how decisive. The work of rebuilding, reforming, and defending continues long after the last enemy retreats beyond the horizon. In proving that ingenuity conquers might, that fire and faith can overcome numbers, Leo III wrote the greatest chapter in siege warfare history and saved Christian Europe from what seemed inevitable conquest. The greatest defensive stand in medieval warfare had achieved everything military victory could accomplish, except permanent peace. The lessons remain relevant across the centuries. When the impossible becomes inevitable, when fire conquers water, when desperate alliances transform desperation into triumph, armies discover that victory belongs not to the numerous, but to the innovative. Not to those who follow conventional wisdom, but to those who dare to rewrite the rules when survival demands it. On August 15, 717, as the sun rose over Constantinople, 15,000 Byzantine defenders faced the mathematical impossibility of defeating 200,000 Arab invaders. When the flames finally settled over Constantinople's ancient walls a year later, those same troops had proven that faith, fire, and unbreakable determination can rewrite destiny itself. The Theodosian Walls still stand today in Istanbul, silent witnesses to that impossible year when the fate of Europe hung by the thinnest of threads and held.